Well, next we're going to talk about Tottenham Hotspur, who narrowly avoided relegation to the Championship on the final day of the season. James, I'm going to come to you first. You've got a piece out on ESPN.com. If you haven't read it already, you should go and check that out. But how have we got here? It's two 17th place finishes in a row now for Tottenham, having not so long ago been in a Champions League final. The descent to where they are now has been pretty rapid and spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, where do you start? Essentially, this is a club that doesn't have a sense of direction from the top. And the piece that I've written starts with a story about how Peter Charrington, who's the new non-executive chairman, took the legends of the club and the club ambassadors for a dinner, which is a sort of habitual regular event that used to take place with Daniel Levy. And what would normally happen at that dinner is the club, Levy in this case, would disseminate information. He would sort of tell everybody the big picture, what they were trying to do, and then that would sort of be fed back to fans through fan events, stadium tours, all the kind of soft touches where the club can just kind of quietly disseminate their messaging, their information, and try to, soften the edges of whatever the frustrations were at the time. And when Charrington hosted this dinner for the first time, instead of doing that, he brought a notebook and he asked the legends what they should do to take the club forward. And to me, that just really exemplifies had the rudderless feel to the club. And I spoke to a lot of people who work at the club for this piece, and the general feel you get back is how soulless it is, how rudderless it feels after Levy. And Levy had his faults, but he was somebody who engaged with people at all levels. Some would say he engaged too much and he listened to too many opinions, but staff always felt as though they had a receptive ear if they wanted to voice a concern or there were problems. And look, a lot of this comes back again to these owners didn't want to be there. There was as much as they deny it, and they've denied again that the club is for sale. Spurs had got quite a long way down the line in negotiating the sale of the club, back end of in last year primarily. And for whatever reason, and there are conflicting reports about this, there's some stuff we can't talk about, but essentially that deal collapsed and the owners remain in place. And since then, they've had to talk a good game. They've had to say, we're custodians of the club, we're here for the long term, we don't want to go anywhere, with no intention of selling, all this sort of stuff. But when you take into that context that they were going to sell, it starts to explain the rudderless feel, the lack of direction, with Daniel Levy going as well, Vinay Venkatesham coming in, Johan Lange, Fabio Paratici coming back and then going again, all the sort of transient feel at the top level, which is filtered down into the sort of confused thinking with the manager appointments, with the transfer recruitment, and just with the general kind of culture at the club that standards have been allowed to slip because they don't really know where they want to go and how they want to get there. And when you start to pull back the layers of all of that, you then can start to understand how that's manifested on the pitch. And Postecoglou, like him or loathe him, decided to essentially compartmentalize the season and sort of fragment the thinking, if you like, to sort of say, well, domestic football basically doesn't matter in the second half of last season because, as he said publicly in interviews since, all that matters is I need to win a trophy, we need to win a trophy, this club's not won any silverware for 17 years. He delivered that, but the club felt it came at too high a price. And that sort of split in thinking is still yet to be resolved. And, Tom was obviously there for the final day for what I'm sure was a very tense and nervous occasion, but they were right on the precipice because they've lacked this direction and clarity for so long.
Well, just on that, I mean, Tom, James just mentioned there that you were in the stadium on Sunday. I was listening on the radio on the way I was driving to City, and they were interviewing Spurs fans outside the stadium. And obviously they only needed a point against Everton, who didn't really have all that much to play for. they'd kind of broken the back of in my mind, they'd already broken the back of that kind of relegation fight. And this last game of the season was just, kind of stamping it. What struck me about the fans who were being interviewed outside that stadium was the nerves. This kind of, no one really wanted to say that they were going to do it. And I found that remarkable, given they only needed a point. I mean, was the atmosphere in the stadium that nervous and that anxious?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was. And it was almost frantic, though, because with the way the team arrived with this kind of plumes of blue smoke and whatever, the flares, is exactly what De Zerbi wanted. Then he came out onto the pitch and everyone went mad, basically. The whole of that vast South Stand were kind of doing whatever he wanted in terms of getting the team ready. But the feeling, say, 3 hours before kickoff, and equally the week leading up after they lost at Chelsea, was a group of fans who were terrified of the unthinkable happening, effectively. I spoke to, for the last 4 weeks, I did a piece for ESPN.com on basically life inside the relegation zone. So I spoke to fans from West Ham, from Nottingham Forest and from Spurs, documenting the highs and lows, the moments of despair, elation, bargaining and whatever. It was almost like, Faustian, what they were going through the whole way through. But eventually they got there. But there's one moment which really struck me, which was in the away game at Wolves on, I think it was April the 25th. I think Spurs took the lead and then Everton equalised at West Ham. And so for a minute, Tottenham were out of the relegation zone. Now, they've been sort of baited by the Wolves fans. They were sung at saying you're coming down with the Wanderers and whatever. And there was a group of, from the Spurs fans I spoke to who were at the game, there was a group of younger fans who started singing, "We are staying up." Now, the older fans basically told them in much less polite ways that I'm going to say to shut up, because them singing it was an admission of the situation they were in. And they were quite keen to escape this sort of reality. This is Spurs. We're a Big Six club. We're in the Champions League final under Pochettino. We won the Europa League and whatever. So for them to try and realise what was going on and then to need something on the final day, it meant that there wasn't a lot of confidence there at all. There was like an expectation perhaps, but not confidence. So that really sort of came across. And then so when Paulinho did score in the first half, there was this huge outpouring of relief. But that tension was there all the way through to the end, even in the 96th minute or whatever it was when Tariq George had a shot saved by Kinski. It was definitely tense the whole way through. And eventually there was this weird situation where you had players celebrating, but equally there's an admission that this has been a disastrous season. Like Spurs finishing 17th for the second successive season is an absolute disaster. And they have to ensure this is the nadir rather than what becomes the norm. So the celebrations were slightly awkward. They kind of jarred with the message. De Zerbi said, "Hey, this is great afterwards. One of my greatest achievements." Equally, we can never be here again. So it was a strange day.
Well, just on that then, James, I mean, the one thing that is for certain is Roberto De Zerbi has got a reaction out of those players to get them out of that relegation fight. I think last season when they finished 17th, I mean, I looked at that table and thought, well, there's no way that Spurs are going to be in that position again because that's just a one-off. You mentioned there about Postecoglou kind of turning away from Premier League games in favour of Europa League, and that obviously played into it. But they are in that situation again. What does next season look like for Spurs? And are you expecting something similar again, or are Spurs going to kind of, inch up the table and become that Big Six team that they obviously believe themselves that they are, even if results on the pitch haven't kind of played that out?
Well, look, I mean, every club that this happens to has to spin it this way. But when they've got no European football, they've got obviously fewer games, which means they can really streamline the squad. They can start making some difficult decisions about players they want to get rid of, and really instill a culture in the club that is driving standards forward and not treading water as it's felt like it has been for the last couple of years. I mean, I've mentioned on this podcast before that Thomas Frank, both publicly and privately, was quite scathing about the squad and knew it was a long-term job. He knew there was no quick fix there. Now, obviously, he didn't get the short-term results to get him out of it. And if anything, what De Zerbi's got out of this group in the last few games has earned him a little bit more credibility, I think, to go into the recruitment meetings and sort of say, right, I'm prepared to make judgment calls on all of these players, and there's going to be quite a few that he's going to want to get rid of, and the club have to support that. And that's really the key thing for Tottenham now, is that they've got to get their recruitment right, and they haven't done that for many, many years. And I've seen there's been a bit of chat in the last 24 hours about potentially reviving a move for Savinho, the City winger. And look, I mean, Rob, you've seen him a lot more than I have. I can sort of see the argument for it. We're not sure exactly how much truth there is in this. I know there was some contact between the clubs last summer, but I think City kind of quickly dismissed any possibility of a deal. So whether they can get a deal over the line for Savinho remains to be seen. But he doesn't strike me as the kind of player that's going to take you from 17th to 4th. But I think there is certainly an intent from the Spurs board to be aggressive in this window. They have money to spend. They've got significant headroom with FFP. Not as much, I think, as people think, because I don't think they've made a profit since 2019. So they are in a position where they are going to have to sell, not going to have to sell, but they're going to sell players anyway. I think it'd be amazing if Christian Romero's there next season for one. I think there'll be 3 or 4 probably reasonably high profile names they'll look to move on, and then can use that money on top of what they have to reinvest into the squad. But yeah, they have to get that recruitment right, and they have to go really all in on De Zerbi, because the one thing I would say is if there is a vacuum within Spurs, well, De Zerbi has the force of personality to fill it. You know, he is that kind of character, and he plays a very specific brand of football that will require a detailed recruitment plan to make it work.
I think after the game as well, he was asked about the next steps. And he said, and in his mind, he said he had a great group of players, was really happy with the squad. He wants to keep between 10 and 12 of them. So if you're looking at a squad which has approximately between 25 to 30 odd players, that's a lot of players he wants to move on. He was asked about, players who have really contributed a lot to them staying up, and he kind of touched on, like, Dragusin was one he mentioned immediately for his character and the way that he'd kept the team going. Kinski, another, whose story, his redemption arc's unbelievable, really. But there are a lot of players there on big salaries who he clearly feels just don't have a future there. Now, that's great in one way, but equally the challenge then is trying to find a new home for them where you don't end up paying a huge portion of wages on loan or whatever. So it's a great idea in sort of in theory, but I know that he wants to keep Palhinha. He said as much after the game. That's good. That's 30 million euros potentially straight away. So it's going to be a balancing act this summer, and he's not traditionally someone who has patience. We've seen him already. His sort of method here was putting his arm around the players. It was different to that in Brighton. It was very different to that in Marseille. He's clearly tried something different, but I think we're likely to see now more of the sort of De Zerbi we do know over the summer and into next season. One who's restless, one who wants success, and one who will demand the highest possible standards.
I did a piece with Edu last week, looking at the sort of inside track of how Arsenal came from, oblivion to win the title. And one of the elements of that that he talked about was the paying up of contracts. The way that once Arsenal had identified the bad eggs, they got them out of the club in a extremely ruthless way. I can't think of another example of where a club, I think it was 9 players, maybe even more actually, that they just paid up to leave. Not full, but 90% of their contracts in some cases, because they were so convinced that the culture of the club, the core of the club was rotten, and they had to restart it and get these players out as quickly as possible and not have them sort of dragging the boat down, as they used to call it. Are Spurs typically, who have not prioritised football over the finances in the past, are they prepared to write off the kind of money? Not saying they aren't going to get any transfer fees for Richarlison or for Christian Romero or for some of the other players who I'm sure are going to leave, but if it comes to the crunch, are they prepared to take a financial hit to reset the club? And that is a big question that needs to be answered this summer. Does this leadership group now, do the people running this club, are they prepared to take the difficult financial decisions to almost sort of clear out the dead wood and the bad eggs and give De Zerbi a core? It doesn't matter if the squad overall is smaller next season because there's no European football. So they can do it, with a smaller group. and really build a nucleus. I'm fascinated to see whether Spurs have the gumption to do it that way and be ruthless and be as clinical as Arsenal were, to get themselves from this really toxic position to where they want to be in future.
Well, just one last one then, to you, Tom, before we move on. I mean, what pool are Spurs shopping in this summer? Because the fans will expect top 6 players because they believe that they're a top 6 club. But I know for a fact that when clubs are in this position, if you're signing for Spurs, you're looking at a team that have finished 17th in 2 consecutive seasons. No top 6 player is going to want to run the risk. As much as it's nice for us to feel that a player is going to go, well, I'm the guy to come in and turn this around, I'm going to get you back up the league. Players don't usually think like that. It would be a big risk for a player to sign for Spurs, because in their head, they'll be thinking, well, if it goes wrong again, I could be playing Championship football in 12 months. Where do you see Spurs spending their money this summer, and what kind of player are they going to be able to attract?
It's a great question. I think James will know more about this than me, but we've seen them linked with Senesi already, that sort of player. So unbelievably good Premier League players, perhaps maybe just under the cusp of being sort of in the top sort of 6 clubs in Europe. You're looking at, I think what they really need to do is prioritise, if I were them, I'd be prioritising sort of the next batch of players like Adam Wharton and these guys, the guys from the Championship, who they can take on and plug in. You've got already brilliant players like Archie Gray. I think these guys should be prioritised next season. I'm a huge fan of his, but equally, you want to find the investments like the Elliot Andersons, the Adam Whartons, these guys who are incredibly talented players, require a little bit of tweaking, and then they can be sort of Champions League standard. They require a bit of patience. I don't know whether they do have that, but equally, that's what he's done so well previously at Brighton. He improved players when he was there. The effect he had on someone like Matoma, he completely transformed him. He pushed Alexis McAllister on there as well, these sort of guys. So he does have an ability to transform and improve players. I think I'd be looking to those sort of figures. Obviously, Andy Robertson's been another one that's been linked, but today we're hearing that perhaps Juventus and a few others are quite keen on him, and why wouldn't you be? He's a great signing for a couple of seasons. He's put so much sort of trust in Ben Davies as well as a guy. His contract's, I think, still up in a month or so. So perhaps, you want to keep him. It's clear that he likes his leaders, the guys who will give everything, and with expecting sort of minimal returns almost. And we've spoken about James Maddison. He's a big personality, but equally, De Zerbi clearly loves him. He kind of wound him up and let him go, like a sort of one of those sort of micro machines, basically. But I don't know, James, what are your thoughts on it? What sort of pool will they be sort of spending or dipping into this summer?
Well, they recognised in January that they needed more leadership, which is why they tried to get Andy Robertson in, and they felt Conor Gallagher had that kind of character. So I think they'll be looking for characters as well as, yes, the more traditional Spurs model of trying to. I mean, habitually they try to sign younger players, mould them, and then they would end up selling them on to a top club, wouldn't they? I mean, they've done a lot of that down the years, as much as they might not like to admit it. The one thing I would say for Spurs is their wage bill as a proportion of their turnover is low. And so they've got a lot of headroom with the wage bill. And I remember speaking to one of the executives last summer about that and saying, is that an area where you can be more aggressive? And the answer I received was essentially yes. They knew that they've got to start paying the bigger wages. And this was obviously at a time when they were thinking about the top 6, not the bottom 6. So I think that they've got some scope there, but that will be the question that you asked earlier, Rob, about how players will think. Well, if they're being paid well, they will go to Spurs, and then it starts to become a bit more of it's the romance allied with the finance that might make it a package that you say, well, look, give me a year, we can get back into the top 6, top 7, get into European football. And then you bring in the other factors. The stadium is incredible. The training ground is incredible. And as an overall package, it starts to become a more appealing club to play for. But they will have to be more aggressive with the wages. It's as simple as that, really.